She was married at 12, gave birth at 13, and spent her entire life plotting to put her son on the throne of England. This is the woman who changed history forever. Think Game of Thrones was intense? The real story of Margaret Beaufort makes that look like a fairy tale. While most 13-year-olds were learning to sew, she was already a widow, a mother, and fighting for survival in the most dangerous game of all, the English throne. By the end of this video, you'll understand how one woman's iron will created the Tudor dynasty and changed England forever. You're about to meet the most ruthless mother in history, and trust me, her story is going to blow your mind. Margaret Beaufort's story starts in 1443, right in the middle of what would become the bloodiest family feud in English history. Born on May 31st at Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire, she entered a world where being born into nobility wasn't a blessing. It was basically signing up for a lifetime subscription to danger, betrayal, and political chaos. Her father, John Beaufort, was the Duke of Somerset, which sounds fancy until you realize that in 15th century England, having a title like that was about as safe as walking around with a target painted on your back. Let me give you some context about the world Margaret was born into. England in the 1440s was a powder keg waiting to explode. The country had been fighting the 100 Years' War with France for, well, about 100 years, and they were losing, badly. The English had been kicked out of almost all their French territories. The government was broke. The nobles were restless. And sitting on the throne was Henry VI, possibly the worst king England ever had. Henry VI was weak, mentally unstable, and completely unable to control his nobles. He'd have these episodes where he'd just completely check out, wouldn't speak, wouldn't move, wouldn't acknowledge anyone around him. Imagine having a king who would randomly go catatonic for months at a time. Not exactly inspiring confidence in the government, right? The nobles started thinking, if this guy can't rule, maybe someone else should. And that someone else depended on which noble family you asked. Here's the thing about medieval England that nobody really talks about. It wasn't just about kings and queens sitting on thrones looking pretty. It was a brutal chess game where every noble family was trying to grab power, and children were the pawns. Margaret's family, the Beauforts, had this weird status. They were descendants of John of Gaunt, one of Edward III's sons, which made them sort of royal, but not quite. See, John of Gaunt had this complicated love life. He had children with his mistress Catherine Swynford while he was married to someone else. Years later, after his wife died, he actually married Catherine. Then he got his buddy King Richard II to legitimize all those kids he'd had out of wedlock. The Beauforts went from being royal bastards to legitimate nobles overnight. But here's the catch. When Henry IV took the throne, he added this little clause that said the Beauforts could have titles and lands, but couldn't inherit the crown. That supposedly part. That's going to matter a lot later. John Beaufort, Margaret's father, had tried to prove the family's worth through military service. He'd been given command of an army in France in 1443, right around when Margaret was born. It was supposed to be his big chance to show everyone that the Beauforts were loyal, competent, and deserving of respect. Instead, it was a complete disaster. His campaign failed spectacularly. He lost battles, lost men, lost money, and lost what little reputation he had. When Margaret was just 1 year old, her father died. Not in battle, not from plague, but possibly from suicide. Yeah, you heard that right. The official story was that he died of disease, but whispers around court suggested he took his own life after being accused of military failures in France. Some said he drank poison. Others said he starved himself to death. Either way, The man was so destroyed by his failure and disgrace that he couldn't go on living. Imagine being barely old enough to walk, and already your family name is tainted with scandal and shame. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, was left with a baby girl and a mountain of political problems. See, when a noble died leaving only a female heir, things got complicated. Women couldn't inherit titles the same way men could. Margaret couldn't become Duke of Somerset, but she could inherit the lands and wealth, which made her incredibly valuable. In medieval England, there was this system called wardship that was basically legalized kidnapping. When a noble child's father died, the king got control of that child. He could sell their wardship to whoever he wanted, and that person would control the child's lands, money, and most importantly, their marriage. The kid became a walking lottery ticket that powerful men could buy and cash in later. Little Margaret became one of these prizes. King Henry VI could sell her wardship to anyone willing to pay, and whoever bought it would control one of the richest inheritances in England. We're talking about estates across multiple counties, thousands of pounds in annual income. Serious money for the time. But more than money, Margaret represented potential. Marry her to your son, and suddenly your family is connected to royal blood. Use her lands to fund your ambitions. Control her, and you control a piece of the complex puzzle of English nobility. The first to grab for this prize was William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk. Suffolk was one of the most powerful men in England, basically running the country, while King Henry VI had his mental episodes. He arranged for Margaret to marry his son, John de la Pole. The ceremony happened in 1450, when Margaret was about 6 or 7 years old. Now, before you freak out about a 6-year-old getting married, let me explain how this worked. Child marriages among nobles were basically business contracts. The kids would have a ceremony, sign some papers, but they wouldn't live together or consummate anything until they were older. Usually 14 or 15 for girls, a bit older for boys. It was all about locking down the alliance and the inheritance rights early. But this particular marriage was doomed from the start. Suffolk had made himself incredibly unpopular by basically surrendering to France and giving away English territories in a desperate attempt to make peace. The English people were furious. They'd spent decades fighting and dying in France, and this guy just gave it all away? In 1450, Parliament turned on Suffolk. He was arrested for treason, banished from England, but he never made it to exile. His ship was intercepted in the English Channel, and Suffolk was executed, basically murdered, by sailors who blamed him for England's failures. With Suffolk dead and disgraced, his family lost all their power. The marriage between Margaret and John de la Pole was dissolved, annulled like it never happened. At 7 years old, Margaret was already on her second failed marriage. Most kids that age are learning to read. She was learning that she was nothing more than a bargaining chip in a game played by men who could die or fall from power at any moment. But Margaret's wardship was still valuable, and it didn't stay unclaimed for long. This time, it went to Edmund Tudor and his brother Jasper. Now, these Tudor brothers were interesting characters. They were the half-brothers of King Henry VI, but through his mother's second marriage, not through royal blood. Their father, Owen Tudor, had been a Welsh servant who somehow managed to secretly marry the king's mother after Henry V died. When people found out, it was a massive scandal. A queen marrying a servant? Unthinkable. But Henry VI, maybe because he was lonely, or maybe because he was just weird, decided to embrace his half-brothers. He gave them titles. Edmund became Earl of Richmond. Jasper became Earl of Pembroke. He gave them lands and money, and he gave them Margaret Beaufort. Well, specifically, he gave Edmund the right to marry her. Edmund Tudor was 24 years old in 1455. Margaret was 12. Yeah, let that sink in. A 24-year-old man was about to marry a 12-year-old girl. And before you think, Well, that was normal back then. No, it really wasn't. Even in medieval England, people thought 12 was way too young for marriage to be consummated. Most noble families waited until girls were at least 14 or 15, sometimes older. The church officially said girls could consent to marriage at 12, but that didn't mean it was socially acceptable to actually treat them as wives in every sense. But Edmund Tudor wasn't interested in waiting. He had ambitions, and he needed an heir fast. See, Edmund understood something that most people missed. The political situation in England was about to explode. The tensions between the Yorkists and Lancastrians were reaching a breaking point. War was coming, and in war, anything could happen. If you wanted to secure your family's future, you needed sons. Legitimate sons. Fast. The marriage ceremony happened on November 1st, 1455. Margaret, 12 years old and probably terrified, stood next to a man twice her age and promised to love, honor, and obey him. The ceremony would have been in Latin, which she might not have fully understood. She would have been dressed in her finest clothes, looking like a doll playing dress-up in adult clothing. Edmund would have put a ring on her finger, a finger so small he probably could have broken it with one hand. And then came the wedding night. I'm not going to go into graphic detail here, but we need to understand what happened to Margaret to understand who she became. Edmund consummated the marriage immediately. Within weeks, Margaret was pregnant, 12 years old and pregnant. Her body, still growing, still developing, now had to support another life. The pregnancy was horrific. She was sick constantly. She could barely eat. She was in constant pain as her child-sized frame tried to accommodate a growing baby. And she was alone. Edmund had taken her to Wales, to his estates there, far from any family or friends she might have had. Wales in the 1450s was not a friendly place for English nobles. The Welsh had their own language, their own customs, their own laws. They'd been conquered by England, but they weren't happy about it. An English noble girl, barely speaking Welsh if at all, pregnant and sick, surrounded by people who saw her as an invader? Margaret must have been absolutely terrified. And then, in November 1456, Edmund Tudor died. He'd been captured by Yorkist forces and imprisoned in Carmarthen Castle. Officially, he died of plague, but there were rumors he'd been murdered, or at least deliberately exposed to disease. Either way, Margaret, at 13 years old, was now a widow. A pregnant widow, alone in hostile territory, with the Wars of the Roses exploding around her. She fled to Pembroke Castle, held by Jasper Tudor, Edmund's brother. Jasper was one of the few people who showed Margaret genuine kindness during this period. He could have abandoned her. She was no longer his brother's wife after all. But he took her in, protected her, gave her sanctuary. For the rest of her life, Margaret would remember Jasper's kindness. When she had power, she'd repay it tenfold. On January 28, 1457, in the depths of winter, in a cold stone castle in Wales, Margaret gave birth. The labor lasted over 30 hours. 30 hours of agony for a 13-year-old girl whose body wasn't ready for this. The midwives thought both mother and child would die. Margaret was so small that the baby could barely pass through the birth canal. The pain was beyond description. She screamed until her voice gave out, then continued screaming silently. But somehow, miraculously, both mother and child survived. The baby was a boy, tiny and weak, but alive. Margaret named him Henry, after the king, Henry Tudor. The birth had been so traumatic, had caused so much internal damage, that Margaret would never be able to have children again. One pregnancy, one birth, at 13 years old, and her body was permanently damaged. She would carry the physical scars for the rest of her life. But something else happened during that long, agonizing labor. Margaret later claimed she had a vision. In her delirium of pain and exhaustion, she said she saw her son crowned as King of England. She saw him, grown, powerful, wearing the crown of England. She heard a voice, maybe God's, maybe her own hope speaking, telling her that this child would be king. Now, whether you believe in religious visions or not, what matters is that Margaret believed it. From that moment, her entire life had a single purpose: to make her son King of England. Every decision she made, every marriage she entered, every alliance she formed, every betrayal she committed, every risk she took, was all for Henry. She transformed from a traumatized girl into something else entirely, a force of nature with a divine mission. But in January 1457, the idea that this baby would be king was laughable. Henry Tudor's claim to the throne was so weak it barely existed. Through his mother, he was descended from the Beauforts, who supposedly couldn't inherit the crown. Through his father, he was related to Henry VI's French mother, which gave him no claim at all. There were literally dozens of people with better claims to the throne. The York brothers, the Neville family, various other nobles with stronger bloodlines. This Welsh-born baby of a 13-year-old widow? He had better odds of becoming Pope than King of England. Margaret understood this. She was young, but she wasn't stupid. In fact, she was brilliant. Even at 13, she could read and write in English and French, understood Latin, knew her history and theology. She understood that in the Game of Thrones, having the best claim wasn't always what mattered. Sometimes, it was about being the last one standing. And the Wars of the Roses were about to turn into a meat grinder that would destroy most of the English nobility. But first, she needed to survive. A 13-year-old widow with a baby and valuable estates was incredibly vulnerable. Within the year, she was married again. This time to Henry Stafford, second son of the Duke of Buckingham. The marriage negotiations were handled by others. Margaret had no say in the matter. She was still legally a child after all. But Stafford seemed decent enough. He was about 25, had good connections to both Yorkist and Lancastrian families, and most importantly, he was willing to protect Margaret and respect her obsession with her son's future. The marriage meant leaving Wales, leaving baby Henry behind with Jasper Tudor. This must have been agony for Margaret. She'd nearly died bringing this child into the world, and now she had to abandon him. But she had no choice. A baby would make her new marriage complicated. Stafford had agreed to marry her, not to raise another man's child. So Henry stayed in Wales with his uncle, and Margaret went to England with her new husband. For the next few years, Margaret lived a relatively quiet life. She and Stafford moved between various estates in England. She ran his households with remarkable efficiency, managed the finances, dealt with tenants and local politics. To outsiders, she seemed like the perfect noble wife, intelligent, pious, dutiful. She heard Mass multiple times a day, read religious texts, gave to charity. Nobody suspected that behind this facade of feminine submission, Margaret was constantly planning, constantly maneuvering, constantly working toward her impossible goal. The 1460s were a nightmare for anyone with Lancastrian connections. In 1461, Edward IV, the young, charismatic Yorkist claimant, defeated the Lancastrians decisively. Henry VI fled to Scotland. His wife, Margaret of Anjou, tried to keep fighting, but was eventually forced to flee to France. The Lancastrian cause seemed dead, and anyone who had supported it was in mortal danger. Jasper Tudor had to flee Wales, and he took young Henry with him. The boy was only 4 years old when he became an exile. They went first to Scotland, then to France, moving constantly, never safe, always on a step ahead of Yorkist agents who would have happily killed them both. Margaret had to receive news of her son through smuggled letters, never knowing if he was safe, if he was healthy, if he even remembered her. Meanwhile, she had to survive in Yorkist England. She had to smile at Edward IV's court, to curtsy to the men who had destroyed her king and driven her son into exile. She had to pretend loyalty while never forgetting her true allegiance. It was a performance that would have broken most people, but Margaret had learned to perform early. She'd been performing since she was 6 years old, playing the role of whatever powerful men needed her to be. Her marriage to Stafford provided good cover. The Staffords were connected to everyone. They had Yorkist relatives and Lancastrian sympathies, perfectly positioned to survive no matter who won. Henry Stafford himself seems to have been a decent man. He didn't beat Margaret, didn't try to control her too strictly, let her maintain her religious devotions and her correspondence. Maybe he loved her. Maybe he just recognized that she was smarter than him and it was safer to keep her happy. Either way, the marriage worked. But Margaret never stopped thinking about Henry. She sent him money when she could, always secretly, always through intermediaries. She gathered information about his life in exile. He was learning French, studying military tactics, growing tall and strong. She noted potential allies, people who were dissatisfied with Yorkist rule, anyone who might someday support her son's cause. In 1470, there was a brief moment of hope. The Earl of Warwick, who had helped put Edward IV on the throne, turned against him. Warwick fled to France and made an alliance with Margaret of Anjou, the exiled Lancastrian queen. Together they invaded England. Edward IV fled to Burgundy, and suddenly, miraculously, Henry VI was king again. Margaret immediately started making plans. She would bring Henry home. He was 13 now, old enough to be presented at court, to start building his own network of supporters. She sent messages to Jasper Tudor, "Bring the boy back." The throne might not be achievable, but at least her son could come home, could claim his inheritance, could live as an English noble instead of a penniless exile. But before Henry could return, disaster struck again. Edward IV came back with a Burgundian army. At the Battle of Barnet, in April 1471, Warwick was killed. At the Battle of Tewkesbury in May, the Lancastrian forces were obliterated. Prince Edward, Henry VI's son and heir, was killed, possibly executed after the battle. Margaret of Anjou was captured and imprisoned. And then, on May 21, 1471, Henry VI died in the Tower of London. The official cause was melancholy, but everyone knew he'd been murdered, probably smothered with a pillow or stabbed while he prayed. Edward IV wasn't taking any chances this time. The direct Lancastrian line was extinct. But here's where things get interesting. With Prince Edward and Henry VI dead, who was the Lancastrian heir? There were no other direct descendants. The closest thing to a Lancastrian claimant was Henry Tudor. Yes, his claim was weak, based on that questionable Beaufort line. But he was literally the only option left for die-hard Lancastrians who refused to accept Yorkist rule. Edward IV understood this. He knew Henry Tudor was now a threat, even if a minor one. He demanded that the Duke of Brittany, where Henry had fled, hand him over. The Duke refused, but he did promise to keep Henry under close watch. Henry Tudor, at 14, was now not just an exile, but a prisoner, unable to leave Brittany, constantly watched, his every move reported to Edward IV. For Margaret, this was both terrifying and thrilling. Terrifying because her son was now a marked man. Edward IV would kill him if he got the chance. But thrilling because for the first time, Henry's claim to the throne wasn't completely laughable. He was the Lancastrian heir, even if by default. The impossible dream had become slightly less impossible. Also in 1471, Margaret's husband, Henry Stafford, died. He'd been wounded at the Battle of Barnet, fighting for Edward IV, ironically enough, and never recovered. Margaret was 28 years old and widowed for the second time. But this time was different. She wasn't a helpless child anymore. She was a woman who had survived 2 marriages, the complete destruction of her political faction, and 14 years of separation from her son. She had lands, money, connections, and most importantly, she had learned how the game was played. Within a year, she married again. Her third husband was Thomas Stanley, and this marriage was a political masterstroke. Stanley was one of the most powerful nobles in England. He controlled vast estates in Lancashire and Cheshire, commanded thousands of men, and had a talent for political survival that bordered on supernatural. The Stanleys had supported Lancaster, then York, then Lancaster again, then York again, always somehow ending up on the winning side. Stanley was also, to put it mildly, morally flexible. He'd betrayed allies, switched sides, broken oaths, and somehow never faced consequences. He was rich, powerful, and completely amoral, exactly the kind of Lady Margaret needed. The marriage was purely political. Stanley got Margaret's estates and her connections. Margaret got Stanley's protection and, more importantly, access to his military power. Stanley seems to have understood exactly what he was getting into. Margaret was no blushing bride. She was a 30-year-old woman with an agenda. She made it clear from the start that her primary loyalty was to her son. Stanley could have her estates, her management skills, her political acumen, but her heart and soul belonged to Henry Tudor. Stanley, who had no illusions about love or loyalty, seemed fine with this arrangement. The marriage transformed Margaret's position entirely. As Lady Stanley, she was one of the most powerful women in England. She had access to court, to information, to resources. She attended Edward IV's court regularly, becoming known for her piety, her learning, her perfect management of Stanley's vast households. She was so obviously competent that even people who disliked her had to respect her. But it was all a performance. The pious, dutiful Lady Stanley was a mask. Behind it, Margaret was building a network that would make modern intelligence agencies jealous. She identified every remaining Lancastrian sympathizer. She noted which Yorkist nobles were unhappy with their rewards. She tracked marriages, births, deaths, constantly updating her mental map of who owed what to whom, who could be turned, who could be trusted. She also worked on her relationship with Edward IV's queen, Elizabeth Woodville. On the surface, they should have been enemies. Elizabeth was a commoner who had married the king, upending the noble hierarchy. Her family, the Woodvilles, had grabbed lands and titles that traditionally went to older noble families. Margaret had every reason to resent her, but Margaret was too smart for petty resentment. She saw that Elizabeth Woodville was vulnerable. The nobility hated her for her common origins. They called her children bastards, whispered that her marriage was invalid. If anything happened to Edward IV, Elizabeth and her children would be in mortal danger. Margaret filed this information away for future use. For 12 years, from 1471 to 1483, Margaret played the long game. She corresponded with Henry and Brittany, always in code, always through intermediaries. She sent him money, information, encouragement. She watched as he grew from a boy into a man, receiving reports from spies in Brittany. He was tall now, athletic, intelligent. He spoke French better than English, having lived in exile for so long. He was cautious, careful, patient, just like his mother. She also worked on securing her position in England. She founded colleges at Cambridge, endowing them generously. She commissioned religious texts, funded churches, supported scholars. She built a reputation as one of the most learned and pious women in England. When people thought of Lady Stanley, they thought of a deeply religious, highly educated, completely harmless woman who had accepted her son's exile as God's will. It was the perfect cover for treason. Then, in April 1483, everything changed. Edward IV died suddenly at age 40. He'd been ill for a few days, nothing serious, and then he was dead. Poison? Disease? Too much wine and women? Nobody knew for sure. But what mattered was that his heir, Edward V, was only 12 years old. A 12-year-old king meant a regency, and a regency meant opportunity for ambitious nobles. The person who controlled the young king would control England. Edward IV had named his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector. But the Woodvilles, the family of the Queen, also wanted power. A power struggle was inevitable. Richard moved fast. He intercepted Edward V on his way to London, arrested the boy's Woodville guardians, and took control of the young king. He also grabbed Edward's younger brother, 9-year-old Richard. Both boys were lodged in the Tower of London, supposedly for their protection until the coronation. But then Richard made a shocking announcement. He claimed that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. Edward had supposedly been pre-contracted to another woman, making his marriage to Elizabeth bigamous and their children illegitimate. It was a ridiculous claim. If true, why hadn't anyone mentioned it during Edward IV's lifetime? But Richard had the power, and power makes its own truth. On June 26, 1483, Richard III was crowned King of England. The two princes, Edward V and his brother Richard, remained in the Tower. And then, sometime that summer, they disappeared. To this day, nobody knows exactly what happened to the princes in the Tower, but everyone at the time assumed Richard had them murdered. Even people who supported Richard believed he'd probably killed them. Child murder was shocking even by medieval standards. For Margaret, Richard's usurpation was the opportunity she'd been waiting for. The Yorkist cause was split. Many nobles who had loyally served Edward IV were horrified by Richard's actions. The Woodvilles were desperate and furious. The common people were disgusted by the apparent murder of children. For the first time in 12 years, there was real, widespread opposition to Yorkist rule. But Margaret needed allies, and she found them in the most unexpected place. She opened secret communications with Elizabeth Woodville, who was hiding in sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her daughters. It was insanely dangerous. If Richard discovered these communications, both women would be executed for treason. But Margaret had a proposal that was brilliant in its simplicity. Henry Tudor would invade England and claim the throne. If successful, he would marry Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter. This would unite the Lancastrian and Yorkist claims, ending the Wars of the Roses once and for all. The red rose and the white rose would become one. It was poetic, practical, and politically brilliant. Elizabeth Woodville, desperate and cornered, agreed. What choice did she have? Richard had allegedly murdered her sons and bastardized her daughters. Her family was being hunted and executed. Henry Tudor might have a weak claim, but he was her only hope for revenge, and her daughter's only hope for restoration. Now Margaret had to convince Henry himself. She sent message after message to Brittany. "The time is now," she urged. "Richard is weak, hated, vulnerable. You have allies in England. The throne is within reach." But Henry was cautious. He'd been in exile for 22 years. England was essentially a foreign country to him. He had no military experience, no army, limited funds. Invading England seemed like elaborate suicide. But Margaret kept pushing. She sent detailed intelligence about Richard's weaknesses. She listed nobles who would support Henry. She sent money, lots of money, stolen from Stanley's coffers and her own estates. She promised that the Stanleys would support him with their vast private army. That last part was a lie. Stanley hadn't agreed to anything, but Margaret would deal with that later. Meanwhile, she was taking incredible risks in England. She was at the center of a conspiracy that included nobles, merchants, and clergy across the country. She coordinated communications, moved money, spread propaganda. Her confession sessions with her priest, Christopher Urswick, were actually planning sessions for treason. Her charitable visits to convents and churches were opportunities to meet with co-conspirators. In October 1483, the conspiracy acted. The Duke of Buckingham, who had helped Richard take the throne, suddenly turned against him. Buckingham raised the standard of revolt in Wales, while Henry Tudor was supposed to invade from Brittany. It was a coordinated assault that should have destroyed Richard. But everything went wrong. Buckingham's timing was off. He revolted before Henry was ready. The autumn weather turned horrible, with massive storms and flooding that made movement impossible. Buckingham's Welsh supporters, who had never really trusted him, deserted. He was captured within days and executed on November 2, 1483. Henry's invasion fleet was scattered by the same storms that had doomed Buckingham. Henry himself barely made it to the English coast, saw that Buckingham's rebellion had failed, and fled back to Brittany. The Great Conspiracy had collapsed in less than 2 weeks. Richard III was furious. He knew Margaret had been at the center of the conspiracy, but proving it was difficult. And even if he could prove it, executing Thomas Stanley's wife would be politically dangerous. Stanley controlled too much military power to antagonize directly. Instead, Richard humiliated Margaret publicly. He stripped her of all her titles and estates, giving them to Stanley to control. She was to be confined to Stanley's properties, forbidden from corresponding with anyone, essentially under house arrest. For most people, this would have been the end. But Margaret Beaufort wasn't most people. House arrest just meant she had more time to plan. Forbidden from corresponding? She developed an even more elaborate network of servants, priests, and merchants who carried messages in code. Stripped of her estates, she convinced Stanley to funnel the money to her cause anyway. She kept writing to Henry, urging him not to give up. Richard's position was weakening daily. He'd had to execute too many nobles after Buckingham's rebellion, making new enemies. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower continued to horrify people. Rumors spread that Richard had poisoned his wife, Anne Neville, who died in March 1485. Whether true or not, the rumors further damaged his reputation. The French were now interested in Henry Tudor as a tool to destabilize England. They offered him money, ships, and mercenaries. Not because they loved him, but because a weak King Henry would be better for France than a strong King Richard. Henry gathered a small force, about 2,000 men, mostly French mercenaries and English exiles. It was pathetically small for conquering a kingdom, but it was better than nothing. In August 1485, Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven in Wales. He chose Wales deliberately. His grandfather Owen Tudor had been Welsh, and Henry played up this connection. He promised the Welsh that a Tudor king would restore their ancient rights and privileges. It was mostly lies, but it worked. As he marched through Wales, men joined him. Not many, but some. Margaret, still technically under house arrest, went into overdrive. She activated every contact, called in every favor, made promises she might not be able to keep. She sent messages to nobles across England. Henry has landed. The time is now. God wills it. She worked on Stanley constantly, alternating between pleading, threatening, and seducing him into supporting her son. Stanley, true to form, hedged his bets. He brought his forces to the battlefield, but wouldn't commit to their side. He told Richard he was loyal, but was delayed by illness. He told Henry he would support him, but needed to wait for the right moment. He told Margaret whatever she wanted to hear. Classic Stanley. Everything came down to one battle. Bosworth Field, August 22nd, 1485. Richard III had about 15,000 men, maybe more. Henry had perhaps 5,000. But the key players were the Stanleys, Thomas and his brother William, who had brought about 6,000 men, but weren't committed to either side. Think about Margaret's position during this battle. Everything she'd worked for, schemed for, sacrificed for, came down to a few hours on a muddy field in Leicestershire. Her son was facing the king in combat. Her husband was sitting on the sidelines with an army that could destroy either force. If Henry lost, she would certainly be executed for treason. If the Stanleys chose wrong, they'd all be dead. The battle started badly for Henry. His forces were outnumbered 3-1. Richard's army was better equipped, better positioned, more experienced. Henry's troops, mostly French mercenaries who didn't particularly care who won, started to waver. It looked like the invasion would end the way everyone expected, with Henry Tudor's head on a spike. But then, Richard made a decision that changed history. He saw Henry on the battlefield, relatively exposed, and decided to end things personally. Richard was a proven warrior, experienced in combat. Henry had never fought a real battle in his life. If Richard could kill Henry in single combat, the invasion would collapse instantly. Richard gathered his household knights, his best warriors, and charged directly at Henry. It was brave, it was bold, and it was exactly what the Stanleys had been waiting for. With Richard committed and vulnerable, William Stanley made his choice. His forces smashed into Richard's flank, just as the king was about to reach Henry. Richard fought brilliantly, desperately. He allegedly shouted, "Treason! Treason!" as Stanley's men surrounded him. He kept fighting even as his horse was killed under him. He refused to flee when his advisors begged him to retreat. In the end, it took multiple men to bring him down. The last Yorkist king died fighting, his crown allegedly falling from his head into a thorn bush. According to legend, and it's probably just legend, but it's too good not to mention, Lord Stanley found the crown and placed it on Henry Tudor's head right there on the battlefield. "King Henry! King Henry!" the soldiers shouted. The son of a 13-year-old widow, born in obscurity, exiled since childhood, had become King of England. When news of Bosworth reached Margaret, she reportedly fell to her knees and wept, not from sadness, but from relief, joy, and probably shock. 28 years of planning, plotting, and praying had finally paid off. Her impossible dream had become reality. Her son was king. But Margaret was too smart to think the battle was over. Winning the throne was one thing, keeping it was another. Henry VII's position was incredibly precarious. His claim to the throne was still weak. He'd won through military victory, which meant someone else could do the same to him. Half the nobility had supported Richard and now feared retribution. The other half had supported Henry, but expected reward he couldn't afford to give. This is where Margaret became invaluable. Henry had been in exile since he was 4 years old. He spoke French better than English. He didn't know the noble families, the court customs, the delicate balance of English politics. He needed his mother's knowledge, her networks, her understanding of how England actually worked. But Margaret was clever enough not to be obvious about her influence. Officially, she was just the king's mother, concerned only with religious matters and managing the royal household. She didn't sit on the royal council. She didn't openly involve herself in state matters. But behind the scenes, she was everywhere. reading dispatches, advising on appointments, managing the delicate dance of court politics. Letters from this period, preserved in various archives, show Margaret's fingerprints on everything. She advised Henry on which nobles to trust and which to watch. She helped word proclamations to appeal to both Yorkist and Lancastrian sympathizers. She managed the complex negotiations for Henry's marriage to Elizabeth of York, ensuring that everyone understood Henry was king in his own right, not because of his wife. That last point was crucial. If Henry's legitimacy depended on his marriage to Elizabeth, what would happen if she died? Or if they divorced? Or if she turned out to be barren? No. Henry had to be legitimate on his own, with the marriage serving as a symbol of unity rather than the source of his authority. Margaret made sure everyone understood this, even if it meant occasionally putting Elizabeth in her place. The coronation was a masterpiece of political theater, and Margaret orchestrated every detail. Henry was crowned on October 30th, 1485, before his marriage to Elizabeth. This was deliberate. He was king first, husband second. The ceremony emphasized his descent from ancient British kings through his Welsh ancestry. It highlighted his Beaufort connection to Edward III. It portrayed him as God's chosen instrument to end the civil wars and bring peace to England. Margaret stood in the abbey, watching her son crowned, and according to witnesses, she showed no emotion. No tears of joy, no smile of triumph. Just calm, controlled observation. But those who knew her noticed her hands. They were clenched so tight, her knuckles were white. 28 years of tension, fear, and hope, all released in that moment, and she wouldn't let anyone see her break. The marriage to Elizabeth of York took place on January 18, 1486. Margaret supervised every aspect: the guest list, the ceremony, the feast, even the consummation. Yeah, you heard that right. It was traditional for witnesses to ensure royal marriages were consummated, to prevent any future challenges to the marriage's validity. Margaret was one of those witnesses. Imagine how awkward that must have been for everyone involved. But Margaret's relationship with Elizabeth was complicated from the start. On one hand, she needed Elizabeth. The marriage gave Henry legitimacy he wouldn't have had otherwise. Elizabeth was beautiful, gracious, and genuinely popular with the people. She was everything Henry wasn't. Warm where he was cold, English where he seemed foreign, beloved where he was merely accepted. On the other hand, Margaret seems to have resented Elizabeth. This young woman got to live with Margaret's son every day, to share his bed, to give him children. Margaret had been separated from Henry for most of his life. Now he was back, but he belonged to his wife and kingdom more than to his mother. There are multiple accounts of Margaret insisting on precedence over Elizabeth at court events, sitting in the Queen's chair, wearing robes that matched or exceeded the Queen's in magnificence. One courtier wrote that Margaret acted more like a queen than the Queen herself. She controlled access to the king, deciding who could see him and when. If you wanted something from Henry VII, you probably had to go through his mother first. She read his correspondence, attended his meetings, influenced his decisions. Some called her "My Lady the King's Mother" with respect. Others used the title with barely hidden resentment. But Margaret's paranoia about security saved Henry's throne multiple times. In 1487, a boy named Lambert Simnel appeared, claiming to be Edward, Earl of Warwick, one of the princes supposedly murdered by Richard III. It was obviously false. The real Earl of Warwick was imprisoned in the Tower. But the Irish believed it, and so did Margaret of York, sister to Edward IV and Richard III, who desperately wanted to destroy Henry VII. An invasion was launched from Ireland, backed by German mercenaries. The rebel forces met Henry's army at the Battle of Stoke Field in June 1487. It was actually a closer fight than Bosworth. If a few things had gone differently, Henry could have lost his throne less than 2 years after winning it. But Margaret's intelligence network had given Henry advance warning. He was prepared, positioned, and ready. Their bells were crushed, and Lambert Simnel, revealed as a baker's son, was pardoned and given a job in the royal kitchens. Margaret's idea, apparently, showing mercy to the puppet while destroying the puppet masters. Then came Perkin Warbeck in the 1490s, another pretender, this one claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes in the Tower. Warbeck was more sophisticated than Simnel. He had the backing of multiple European powers who wanted to destabilize England. He knew details about the Yorkist court that he shouldn't have known. Some people genuinely wondered if he might be telling the truth. Margaret's response was methodical and ruthless. She deployed spies across Europe to investigate Warbeck's true identity. She spread counter-propaganda, revealing him as the son of a Flemish boatman. She worked to isolate him diplomatically, convincing or bribing European rulers to withdraw their support. When Warbeck finally invaded England in 1497, his support evaporated because Margaret had already destroyed his credibility. He was captured, imprisoned, and eventually executed when he tried to escape. But Margaret wasn't just about crushing threats. She genuinely tried to use her power for good. She founded Christ's College, Cambridge in 1505, refounding an earlier institution and endowing it generously. She established St. John's College, Cambridge, though it wasn't completed until after her death. These weren't just vanity projects. They were serious educational institutions that would shape English intellectual life for centuries. She was passionate about education, especially religious education. She commissioned the first English translations of many religious texts, including The Imitation of Christ by Thomas A. Kempis. She supported scholars like John Fisher, who became her confessor and closest advisor. She promoted the idea that nobles should be educated, not just in warfare and estate management, but in theology, philosophy, and languages. Her daily routine was austere to the point of self-punishment. She rose at 5 a.m. for private prayer, heard multiple masses throughout the day, and often stayed up past midnight reading religious texts or dealing with correspondence. She wore hair shirts under her fine clothes, rough, uncomfortable garments meant to mortify the flesh. She fasted regularly, sometimes eating nothing but bread and water for days. Some historians interpret this extreme piety as guilt over her past actions. The conspiracies, the betrayals, the people who died because of her schemes. Maybe it all weighed on her conscience. Others see it as genuine religious devotion, the natural evolution of the faith that had sustained her through decades of suffering and separation. Maybe it was both. Human psychology is complicated, and medieval psychology even more so. Her relationship with her grandchildren was intense and controlling. Prince Arthur, born in 1486, was the heir, the future of everything Margaret had built. She supervised every aspect of his upbringing, his education, his diet, his exercise routine, even his sleeping schedule. She chose his tutors personally, interviewed them extensively, and fired them if they didn't meet her standards. She had specific ideas about what a king should be. Arthur needed to be learned but not bookish, pious but not fanatical, strong but not brutal, diplomatic but not weak. She created a detailed educational program that included Latin, French, theology, history, mathematics, and military strategy. The boy was basically given the education Margaret wished Henry VII could have had if he hadn't spent his youth in exile. Prince Henry, the future Henry VIII, was born in 1491. As the second son, he was originally destined for the church, and Margaret made sure he got an excellent religious education. He could read Latin fluently by age 7, knew large passages of the Bible by heart, and could debate theology with grown priests. The irony that this religiously educated prince would later break with Rome and dissolve the monasteries would have horrified Margaret. Princess Margaret and Princess Mary received educations far beyond what was normal for noble girls. Margaret Beaufort believed that royal women needed to be as educated as royal men. You never knew when they might need to rule or at least influence rulers. She made sure her granddaughters could read and write in multiple languages, understood mathematics and accounting, knew history and theology. They were probably the best educated women in England after Margaret herself. But the person Margaret was closest to, besides Henry VII, was John Fisher. He became her confessor in 1497 and remained her closest advisor until her death. Fisher was brilliant, a theologian, mathematician, and eventually Chancellor of Cambridge University. But more than that, he understood Margaret. He saw past the powerful king's mother to the traumatized girl who had never fully healed. He provided spiritual comfort, but also intellectual stimulation, discussing theology and philosophy with her for hours. Their relationship was probably the closest thing to friendship Margaret ever experienced. They worked together on her educational foundations, her charitable works, her translations. Fisher later said that Margaret had a man's heart in a woman's body, which was about as close to calling a woman an equal as a medieval priest could get. When Protestant reformers executed Fisher in 1535 for refusing to accept Henry VIII's break with Rome, they destroyed one of the last links to Margaret's world. As the 1490s progressed, Margaret's influence seemed to grow rather than diminish. Most kings' mothers would have been gradually pushed aside as the king established his own authority. But Henry VII seemed to depend on his mother more over time, not less. Maybe it was because he trusted no one else completely. Maybe it was because her advice was consistently good. Or maybe, after a lifetime of separation, he couldn't bear to push her away. She involved herself in everything. When Henry VII negotiated the marriage of Prince Arthur to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, Margaret was deeply involved. She understood that this Spanish alliance would elevate England from a second-rate power to a major player in European politics. She also understood that it would bring Spanish gold to England's chronically empty treasury. The negotiations took years, with Margaret managing much of the correspondence. She dealt with the Spanish ambassadors, charming them with her knowledge of Latin and her deep piety. They wrote back to Spain that the king's mother was a woman of great wisdom and virtue, whose support was essential for any agreement. When Catherine finally arrived in England in 1501, it was Margaret who greeted her, evaluated her, and ultimately approved her. The wedding of Arthur and Catherine in November 1501 was the triumph of Margaret's life. Her grandson, the heir she had shaped and molded, was marrying a Spanish princess, cementing England's place among the great powers of Europe. The ceremonies were magnificent, days of tournaments, feasts, pageants. Margaret supervised everything, down to the color of the servants' livery and the placement of every noble at the feast. But triumph turned to tragedy in April 1502. Prince Arthur died suddenly at Ludlow Castle, just 5 months after his wedding. He was only 15 years old. The cause was probably sweating sickness, a mysterious disease that killed with terrifying speed, but some suspected poison. Catherine of Aragon, who had also been ill, survived, but Arthur was dead within days of falling sick. The death of Arthur shattered Henry VII. This was his heir, his future, the validation of everything he had fought for. Margaret, despite her own grief, had to hold her son together. She comforted him, managed the funeral arrangements, and most importantly, dealt with the political implications. Prince Henry, 10 years old and completely unprepared, was now heir to the throne. Margaret immediately took charge of Prince Henry's new education. He had been prepared for the church, not the crown. Now he needed to learn statecraft, military strategy, the art of kingship. Margaret redesigned his entire educational program in weeks, bringing in new tutors, new masters of arms, new advisors. The boy resisted at first. He was used to more freedom as the spare heir, but Margaret's will was iron. He would be king, and he would be prepared. The question of what to do with Catherine of Aragon was delicate. Should she return to Spain? Should she marry Prince Henry when he was old enough? The Spanish wanted to maintain the alliance and suggested Catherine marry her former brother-in-law. Church law generally forbade such marriages, but dispensations could be obtained. Margaret favored keeping Catherine in England, maintaining the Spanish alliance, but she also worried about the theological implications. Then, in February 1503, Queen Elizabeth died in childbirth, trying to give Henry another heir after Arthur's death. She was only 37 years old. The baby died too. Henry VII was destroyed. Whatever their marriage had started as, a political necessity, it had become genuine love. Henry withdrew into himself, becoming even more paranoid, more miserly, more dependent on his mother. Margaret essentially became queen in all but name. She managed the royal household, supervised their reigning royal children, handled much of the kingdom's diplomacy. Foreign ambassadors often spent more time with Margaret than with Henry. She was the power behind the throne, and everyone knew it. But she was also aging. Born in 1443, she was 60 years old in 1503, ancient by medieval standards. She had outlived 3 husbands, countless conspirators, most of her generation. She had achieved everything she had dreamed of. Her son was king, her bloodline secured, her enemies destroyed. But the cost had been enormous. She had sacrificed her childhood, her body, her peace of mind, arguably her soul, all for this achievement. Her health began to fail in the early 1500s. Nothing dramatic at first, just the accumulation of decades of stress, poor diet from constant fasting, and the lingering damage from that traumatic childbirth when she was 13. She tired more easily, needed help walking, sometimes forgot things she had always remembered. For someone who had controlled every detail of her life, this loss of control must have been terrifying. But she pushed on, driven by the same iron will that had sustained her for 60 years. She continued to advise Henry VII, to supervise Prince Henry's education, to manage her religious foundations. She began planning her own funeral with the same attention to detail she brought to everything else. The prayers to be said, the alms to be distributed, the exact positioning of her tomb. In early 1509, Henry VII's health began to fail rapidly. Years of stress, paranoia, and probably depression had worn him down. He was only 52, but he looked decades older. As he lay dying in Richmond Palace, he called for his mother constantly. She sat by his bedside for days, holding his hand, praying, offering comfort. Witnesses said he seemed to become a child again in his final days, seeking his mother's approval and blessing. On April 21, 1509, Henry VII died. His last word was reportedly, "Mother." Margaret had outlived her son's enemies, his wife, his eldest son, and now she had outlived Henry himself. The boy she had nearly died bringing into the world, the son she had schemed and sacrificed to make king, was dead. Prince Henry, now King Henry VIII, was 17 years old. Margaret supervised Henry VIII's coronation with her typical efficiency, even though she could barely stand. The ceremony took place on June 11, 1509, a joint coronation with Catherine of Aragon, whom Henry had married just days before. The marriage to his brother's widow was controversial, but Margaret had supported it. The Spanish alliance was too valuable to lose, and she believed the papal dispensation made it acceptable in God's eyes. Standing in Westminster Abbey, watching her grandson crowned, Margaret must have reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. From a 13-year-old widow, giving birth in a Welsh castle, to the grandmother of the King of England. From a powerless pawn in other people's games, to one of the most powerful people in Europe. From an impossible dream to an established dynasty. But even at this triumph, Margaret was thinking ahead. She worried about Henry VIII. He was different from his father. Impulsive where Henry VII had been cautious. Extravagant where his father had been miserly. Confident where his father had been paranoid. He was handsome, charismatic, athletic, everything a king should be. But Margaret saw the danger in that confidence. A king who thought he could do no wrong was a king headed for trouble. She tried to advise him, but Henry VIII wasn't interested. He loved his grandmother, respected her, but he didn't need her the way Henry VII had. He had grown up in England, understood its politics instinctively, had his own ideas about kingship. He dismissed many of his father's advisors, the men Margaret had carefully placed. He started spending the fortune Henry VII had accumulated, the gold Margaret had helped squeeze from England. Margaret was too tired and too wise to fight him. She had played her part, secured the dynasty, fulfilled her divine mission. What Henry VIII did with his inheritance was between him and God. She retreated more and more into religious contemplation, spending hours in prayer, preparing for the death she knew was coming. On June 29, 1509, just 18 days after her grandson's coronation, Margaret Beaufort died. She was 66 years old, ancient for the time, having outlived almost everyone from her generation. The Wars of the Roses were history now, something old people talked about, but young people could barely imagine. England was entering a new age, and Margaret had helped create it. Her funeral was magnificent, as she had planned. Her body lay in state for 3 weeks while thousands came to pay their respects. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, in Henry VII's chapel, in a tomb she had designed herself. The inscription, which she had written, described her as Margaret, Countess of Richmond, mother of King Henry VII, grandmother to King Henry VIII. But her true epitaph was the dynasty she left behind. Henry VIII would reign for 38 years, transforming England in ways Margaret could never have imagined. He would break with Rome, dissolve the monasteries Margaret had supported, execute the scholars she had patronized. He would have 6 wives, desperate for the male heir Margaret had provided in one traumatic birth. The irony would have killed her if she hadn't already been dead. Henry's daughter Mary would try to restore Catholicism, burning Protestants with a fervor that matched Margaret's own religious intensity. His other daughter Elizabeth would become one of England's greatest monarchs, displaying the political brilliance Margaret had pioneered. The Tudor dynasty would end with Elizabeth in 1603, but its impact would last forever. And what about Margaret's deeper legacy? She had proven that a woman could wield political power in a world that denied women political agency. Every powerful woman who came after, Elizabeth I, Victoria, Margaret Thatcher, Elizabeth II, owed something to Margaret Beaufort. She had carved a path where none existed, shown that determination could overcome any odds, that the longest game could defeat the strongest opponent. But we should be careful not to romanticize her. Margaret was no feminist hero. She never questioned the system that had married her at 12 and destroyed her body at 13. She never fought for other women's rights. When she had power, She used it to advance her family, not her gender. She was perfectly happy to use other women as pawns, just as she had been used. She was also, by any objective measure, responsible for enormous suffering. Her conspiracies led to deaths, executions, battles. Families were destroyed because of her schemes. Men died at Bosworth and Stoke Field, and a dozen smaller conflicts because Margaret Beaufort wanted her son to be king. She might have been doing God's work, as she believed, but God's work involved a lot of bloodshed. Yet we can't deny her extraordinary achievements. In an age when women were property, she accumulated power. In a game rigged against her, she won. When fate dealt her the worst possible hand-child marriage, traumatic birth, separation from her only child, she played that hand with such skill that she changed history. The little girl married at 12, who nearly died giving birth at 13, who should have been forgotten by history, instead became one of its architects. She took a baby with virtually no claim to the throne and made him king. She took a weak, exiled boy and turned him into the founder of a dynasty. She took her own trauma and suffering and transformed it into iron determination that nothing could break. That's the real story of Margaret Beaufort. Not a fairy tale of good triumphing over evil, but a complex narrative of survival, ambition, and the price of power. She was simultaneously victim and victimizer, brilliant strategist and traumatized child, devoted mother and ruthless politician. She was deeply religious, yet capable of profound deception. She promoted learning while supporting tyranny. She was, in other words, devastatingly human. Modern historians debate her legacy endlessly. Was she a strong woman succeeding against impossible odds, or a manipulative schemer who caused unnecessary suffering? Was she a devoted mother, doing everything for her son, or an ambitious politician using her son for her own goals? Was she a victim of her circumstances, or a creator of them? The answer, of course, is yes, all of it. Margaret Beaufort was complicated in ways that don't fit neat categories. She defies simple moral judgments. She was a product of her brutal time, who also transcended it. She accepted the rules of her world while secretly rewriting them. She was both the 13th century child bride and the woman who made kings. Perhaps that's why her story resonates even today. We recognize in Margaret something universal: the refusal to accept defeat, the determination to protect our children, the will to survive and thrive despite trauma. We also recognize the moral complexity, the prices we pay for our ambitions, the compromises we make with our consciences. Margaret would probably be appalled by the modern world. The democracy, the women's rights, their religious freedom, all of it would seem like chaos to her medieval mind. But she would understand the power dynamics, the political maneuvering, the constant struggle for advantage. The game she played is still being played, just with different rules and different stakes.